Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Tim.
I feel like it's been a while since you and I have connected,
Yes, yes, I've
and
missed you.
I've missed you too. We've been talking back and forth about a variety of different topics to focus on, and I think today where we're going to land is we're going to talk about context,
Mm-hmm.
and context as it relates to Virginia Satir's work. I had a conversation with Stephen Buckby, and when he talked about a demonstration that Virginia did, he kept referencing her connection and use of the context, whether it was the audience, whether it was maybe the camera crew that was there, her awareness and her
Oh, yes.
use of the
Oh,
context was a
yes.
very powerful. And so, within her way of working and with my connection to various people that have been trained by her and the training that I've gone through, this word context has come up again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, she would often draw this circle with self, and that was divided into three pieces, like three pieces of a pie. One would focus on the element of the self,
Mm-hmm.
one would focus on the element of others. So these
Mm-hmm.
is the subjective aspects of me and you, and then the
Mm-hmm.
context. And my initial understanding about context was the physical environment, the place that you're in. So I wanted to sort through with you context as it relates to, um, well, as it relates to healing, as it relates to growth, our potential connection to it, because I think it's a factor that can easily be forgotten. So much of psychology focuses on, let's say, emotions or behavior, but I think that focusing on and having an awareness of context deepens
Mm-hmm.
those things. And in
Yes.
that way, I think that context is related to the term systemic,
Mm-hmm.
because it's how do these multiple factors influence and interact with one another. Now you're starting to talk about something like, for example, between you and I, there's a space. What's happening
Mm-hmm.
in the space between us?
Mm-hmm.
And that's starting to relate to the context. So, what are your initial thoughts when trying to at least describe or define context? What comes to mind?
Well, one of the things that flashed as you were talking was uh, when I have worked with gang interventionists and their agencies,
Hmm.
one of the things that I have really tried to highlight was the context for making contact. For example, somebody walks in the front door and they've just been expelled from school. And in an agency, the agency I was working in, there wasn't much private space, okay? So to help that uh, counselor or a gang interventionist right away begin to think about the context that I am going to create to get this young person as much privacy as possible, the context of making contact by putting down my iPhone, which it turns out is so hard for
Yeah.
anybody to do these days, and to focus and to get as much distraction out of the way, and then to be conscious of the context that this person just came from,
Mm,
of feeling humiliated, angry, whatever's going on with them at the school,
right.
you know. So it's, to me, those kind of contexts are really, really important for a therapist, a coach, you know, a
Yeah.
mentor, anybody
Yeah.
to think about the context that you're creating and the container really
Hmm.
for safety for.
Well, I think, yeah, you're hitting upon a word when you say the context that you're creating. I was watching an interview with Virginia and a family that's on the Satir Global website. In this initial interview, it's the first time that she's meeting this family, and um, she asked them, how are you doing? How are you feeling right now? And the boy says, I've got something going on in my stomach.
Mhm.
And then she asks, what are you using from out here to create those feelings? Is it the
Right.
camera? Is it the audience? Is it my funny face? She makes a joke,
Yeah.
and she's referencing how are you using the environment to create an experience on the inside. So that word create comes up,
Yes.
and I think we're constantly interacting with um, things that are coming in, whether for a sensory experience, that is the context. You know, as I've been thinking about this, it seems like context is so important because when I start to think about it more and more, everything seems to become context. Context seems to consume everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, how am I interacting with you? Well, I'm interfaced with you through technology,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's affecting our connection. It would
Right.
be a very different experience if Sharon, you and I were face to face, and you know, I could really, because right now I'm looking at, like even right now, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at your eyes on the
Mm-hmm.
screen,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we're imagining we're making eye contact, but we're not,
Mm-hmm.
right? The computer's producing this thing, but at least being able to see your face is allowing me to connect to a feeling about that. That
Yes.
would be different than maybe if I couldn't see your face. And if I couldn't see your face, then I'd have to use the context of your voice
Yes.
as it's coming, the sound is coming into my ears. How am I using that? So I think in terms of empowerment, which we were talking about before we started, I think it can be such an empowering thing to think I'm interacting with my context all the time. How am I using what's around me? How am I using what I'm seeing?
Mm-hmm.
What's my relationship like to the context? Um, I think is empowering, and it becomes then a creative force. It becomes
Mm-hmm.
creative power
Mm-hmm.
to think, well, what am I taking in, and then putting
Yes.
out from that.
Yeah.
So,
Whether you call it self-leadership or congruence, that consciousness of choice, of how am I going to use this context. And I think in terms of relationships, it's extremely important that you make choices about what you say to whom and when. You know, that
mhm,
if it's a I've seen people violate their marriages a lot by being at a party or something and saying something that they're scared to say at home, and they violated that the, the the boundaries of that marriage,
right.
or somebody who is making a presentation and somebody else who publicly says something critical to them, a colleague, rather than saying it privately. So the
Yeah.
consciousness of violation of a context, I think, is really an important one.
Yeah, I wonder if thinking about, like, one way of thinking about context is, um, what is the function of where we are at a moment in time,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what, in terms of the function and the purpose, right?
Exactly.
That
Yes.
that establishes the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to see the doctor, I'm not there to bring wine and cheese to
Yes.
lay it out on this table. That's not the function of that. So then
Mm-hmm.
that gets into role. The
Mm-hmm.
context where we are establishes role, and then we
Mm-hmm.
know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Then that shapes our experience and then our perception. Um, and I was thinking about when people are really unwell, when they're disconnected, let's say they're dissociated, maybe they're
Mm-hmm.
having, a psychotic break.
Mm-hmm.
They're then disconnected from their context. They're disconnected from other people. They're
Yes.
disconnected from their environment. If they're experiencing schizophrenic symptoms, they're so much in their internal subjective experience that
Mm-hmm.
there's a space now between them and the outer world,
Mm-hmm.
the world that is, maybe what people are interacting with mutually,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that is, whether that's something like schizophrenia or the dissociation or the disconnection of depression, say, depressive,
Mm-hmm.
it is a lowered energy where a person feels out of touch with
Yes.
themselves, out of touch with others. So I think
Yes.
this talking about this relationship, what is your relationship to
Mm-hmm.
context, is so important because there's an outer context, there's a physical environment like the room you're in, the room that I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think you could also talk about what is going on in the inner context,
Exactly.
right? Uh,
Yes. Which belongs a lot to the context of how you grew up and your experience growing up.
right.
Family therapy.
You're carrying that around. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
You're
That whole
carrying that around.
context is in there all the time. Yes.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
thinking about, I took a training many years ago in family therapy, structural family therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
our supervisor, the way they did it was, it's out of the Philadelphia clinic. The way is that the person practicing is working with a family, and then there's a two-way mirror, okay? Yep. And then there's a supervisor on the other side who can call into you, and the family understands this as part of the training and say, have you thought about this? Have you tried this? And our supervisor said, I want you to understand that if I call in, that's merely a suggestion from this side of the glass. You are in that room. You are reading the energy, and I respect that above all, which is exactly what you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah. 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 That's it's such a powerful thing because, you know, when I've had that experience, when I was going through my training, the trainers that were training us utilized reflective circles or within narrative therapy.
Right, right.
So the people observing, let's say behind the glass, observing the session would then come into the room. The therapist and the observers would have a conversation that would highlight what were the things and themes and resources that stood out to them that would give an empowering message. And then the family could either go into the observation room or they could sort of just sit and then process what they're hearing from a third-party observer of the conversation. And then that could be a supportive thing. So it was utilizing the context in a creative way to have these kinds of layered conversations. And I think where I think playing with context has also been powerful is any kind of demonstration I've seen of therapy, of family therapy, where there's an audience. And I think where the audience is there for training, I've been in, or it's a clinical group or a counseling group or something like that. When it's not just the therapist and the couple, therapist and the family, or therapist and the individual, but the therapist and this group surrounding maybe a few people doing the work, whether it's one family or a couple or something like that. That group then serves as a community that helps support and hold the energy with their attention. Yes. And I think that that amplifies something. I don't know what it is, but it amplifies something where it makes the therapy even more powerful somehow. It makes it's something I think, I don't know, where community is missing in people's lives or missing in our culture. I feel like it brings that back into the experience where, hey, you know, it's not just you isolated with this one therapist.
Right.
You know, you're surrounded by a community. And this is what happens when people, you know, when I've seen young people or teenagers go into residential programs, it's like that's when they get it, because they're living in a context with child and youth workers, family therapist, individual therapist, and then family, extended family, so on and so forth. It's an extension of a variety of levels of support. Sometimes it's child protection services, and so there's a variety of different people playing a different role in these families' lives. And you know, that's when things are going not well, you know. But I think there's, in terms of community practice and bringing that in, I think that's a touch point with context that I'm curious about. You know, wanting to work more with groups, wanting to work more with intensive experiences over days, not just 1 hour at a time. I think this is, and you know, like what I know Virginia did was 30-day trainings. Like, could you speak to that just in terms of the relationship between community and context and your experience with that?
I really believe the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that that when you have a supportive group, whether that's, you know, a 12-step group, some kind of spiritual group, where there is a sacredness about the connections, that there is an intention in there, that there is a lift up. I used to say it's like, if I am low on myself that day, and I'm not very, all my parts are, you know, firing, and I'm not in myself, I'm not in my home. And I go to my spiritual community, I can borrow from the bank, because I will feel it. Okay. On the other hand, if I'm in a good place, when I go, I am adding to the self so somebody else can borrow from the bank. It's all unspoken, but it's there. And I'm reading Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score, and he talks so much about the need for social network support in the process. And I'm a part of a choir, and I have been for years. And he over and over talks about the importance of choirs, of support groups, you know. And
Wow.
yes, I was drumming, helping the body with rhythms and movement, which I thought of you, Tim. And so I was sharing this with a friend who's in my choir, and she said, "Oh, Sharon, it's the choir that had helped me go through the really dark times of cancer." And I never knew that, Tim. I never knew it was our choir. That she said I would say, "Oh, I just can't go," and then I would go and I go, "Oh, I feel better," you know.
Yeah, it's so funny, Sharon. Like some of my favorite people, I'm just noticing, like you're all in a choir. It's like I need to be in a choir.
Yes,
sounds,
yes. And you know, one of the high
yeah,
points of my life
yeah,
was I was in Hong Kong for the Satir conference in 2010.
yeah.
And there's a man named Ekman Tan who is a Christian minister who has also written about Satir. And somebody said, "Hey, would you like to go up to the center? It's kind of the top of this mountain area in Hong Kong to meet Ekman." And I said, "I would love it." So we drove up there, and it was about noontime. And he said, "Would you like to go have a chanting experience with me?" Oh, God, I'd love this. So we went down maybe 50 feet from where the center was. It was a cave. And the cave had been set up so that there were benches on the side. And so this group of us all sat together and chanted inside this cave for 30 minutes. Oh, my God. It was incredible. And, you know, there is this oncologist, what's his name? Michael something, I'm blanking, who really, really promotes the power of sound therapy as an adjunct to chemotherapy or whatever you're going through. Because he says like 97% of the body is fluid. And when you are, you know, creating harmonious vibrations into the body, it's very healing. And one of the stories he tells in his book, it's called The Sounds of Healing, is that there was this group of priests or monks in France who were getting ill all the time. And nobody could figure out why they couldn't, you know, stay well. So somehow they brought in this sound therapist, and he's asking them all kinds of questions. And he said, "So when did this start?" And they start realizing it started after one of the popes came through with all those changes, and they weren't doing nearly as much as they were used to doing in terms of ritual. They said, "We used to chant like 6 hours a day, and now we only chant 2. And he said, "You need to go back to 6 because your bodies are used to that."
Right.
And they're not defending against it. So supposedly, when they went back to that, they got better. So I think there's
So there's an oncologist. There's an oncologist who wrote a book
Yes,
called The Sounds of
Michael.
Healing.
Sounds of Healing, Michael something. I can't remember his last name.
We'll use the power of Google to figure this out. Right. Healing. Sound of Healing. A physician reveals the power of sound. Mitchell Gaynor.
That's it. Mitchell Gaynor. That's it. Yes.
Okay, Mitchell Gaynor, Sounds of Healing. Okay, I'm gonna check that out. You know, I mean, just so I think there's 2 things that come to mind, which is what's happening with the breath when you chant, and how deep, like for choir, right? How deep breath, how in tune with your body, how present do you need to be? Then when you're synchronizing that sound across a group, what's happening there?
Yes.
But I think in terms of the power of the science related to um, heart rate variability and what happens when you extend your breath, right? Because the
Mm-hmm.
inhalation activates the sympathetic nervous system,
Right.
the exhalation activates the parasympathetic nervous system,
Yes.
the exhalation calms, the exhalation
Yes.
slows things down, lowers
Yes.
cortisol, stress
Yes.
hormones.
Yes.
And then what are the other sort of physiological effects
Mm-hmm.
that I think are, just to add that part of my curiosity of what's going
Yes.
on with sound. I'm not um, I'm not part of a choir. I'm not um, formally trained in any kind of music, but I do appreciate, because I grew up. My parents brought me to church. I always loved singing and loved witnessing and choir, and I think that kind of group synchronicity, even when you go to a concert and you're
Mm-hmm.
singing along, there's something
Yes.
really magical happening. The
Yes.
Toronto Raptors, our basketball team, won
Yes.
the
I
champion.
actually rooted for them against my California team.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks to you. That's why
Not,
they won.
not. My husband wasn't happy about that much.
Yeah, I know. And you're
And I
stating
have
it all
all these
over
friends
here.
in Toronto, and the Raptors deserve this. Absolutely.
Yeah, 24 years coming and the
Oh,
one Canadian
yes.
team. But you think about like tens of thousands of people, millions of
Yes.
people across the
Yes.
country chanting, expelling the loudest sound that they can from the deepest part of their lungs. And there's all this joy, there's all this
Yeah.
happiness, there's all this connection
Yep.
happening. I mean, to look at it that way on such a grand
Yes.
scale is
Yes.
something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess coming back to our original topic of context, it's like,
Yep.
what does what is your sound production doing to the context, right? So if I'm interacting with my son and what's inside of me is irritability,
Mm-hmm.
frustration about something, and then what comes out is a sound
Mm-hmm.
that matches that I haven't yet contained or haven't acknowledged. It just comes out unconsciously.
Right.
What is that putting out in the context, And like I'm sure most people have had the experience when someone's in a bad mood and they walk into the room, you
Yes.
feel something, the way they're
Oh,
carrying,
yes, you
whether
do.
it's visually, you see the way they're carrying their body,
Yep.
the lack of communication, or
Yep.
something else that's beyond sensory experience. You feel something shift,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the interaction between the inner and the outer context, and being aware of that and paying attention to that, being able to just even put your finger on it, I think is so powerful. This is, all of our work as therapists is trying to increase awareness. But I guess what I'm curious about in this conversation with you is how thinking about the word context differentiates itself from, often we talk about psychological patterns of feeling, of beliefs, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot to do with psychological forms of consciousness. But I think one of the strengths of Virginia Satir's work is she would not stop there. She would think about the various layers of context. And in that interview I was telling where she's interviewing this family, she takes a few minutes to make sure that the mother is sitting comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
She helps her adjust her chair. She creates a little bit more space between herself and her son and her husband.
Mm-hmm.
She just makes a big point out of being aware of the physical proximity and comfort that each family member was having, and to point
Mm-hmm.
those things out. And um, I think now when we have so much distraction, we can kind of blend into our phones or kind of lose connection to our physical environment. Um, it's getting easier and easier to lose touch with context. So
Exactly. I think it's a serious problem in terms of relationships.
yeah, yeah,
You're really helping me to appreciate that that piece with Virginia working. Because I've just thought of it more as making contact with each person. But you're right. She's really thinking about setting the context for safety and equality and contact, all of that. Yes.
yeah, yeah. And um, that's where my working definition, which is not so helpful for me, is context is everything. Which people talk about that. That's like as a as a meme, it's not helpful in the sense of creating a limiting definition, but at least at this point, as I'm thinking about it, it's expanding my awareness of it, right? So
Mhm.
if I think about context as being everything, what could that mean? It's um, how are the clothes that I'm wearing affecting me? How are the clothes that I'm wearing affecting others?
Mhm.
Right? The colors that I'm choosing to wear, um, smells, right? Like, if there's an air freshener, or if there's maybe I'm not sensitive to sound, but maybe someone I'm working with is, how is that
Yes.
affecting them?
Yes.
And then that physical part of the context interacting with the individual gives us an opportunity to practice, let's say, the freedom to comment.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
by modeling that and saying, how,
Yeah.
before we even get started, how are you feeling here? Just kind of
Right.
look around the room.
Yep.
What are you noticing about it? Let
Yeah.
yourself get grounded here.
Yes.
Is there anything that you're attracted to, or is there anything that you don't like? And
Mhm.
some of the people that I work will say, I really like that picture you have behind you. It really makes me think
Mhm.
of this, and so forth. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
That's a
being
good
in
point.
touch
Yes.
with your
Yes.
physical environment, the context is so important. But um, yeah,
I think there's another layer, Tim, that's only come to me recently, which is not external,
hmm
but I think is really important in terms of thinking about context of self, other, and context, is the context of the developmental stage of each person in the family. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah,
and it changes all the time, right? So every developmental change of that child, or of the marriage, or the partnership, whatever it is, all of those developmental changes are really changes in context.
right, right, yeah. And when you talk about developmental tasks, it's I guess it's at least two things. One, what is the what what is the developmental process that they're mastering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe for a toddler into preschool, it's like they're mastering sound, and they're mastering the use of three-word sentences, say,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what are they going into next? Well, maybe they're, as a toddler between 2 and 4, they're developing greater awareness of others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perspective taking, and more emotion regulation, more
Mm-hmm.
awareness of their emotions, and the ability to communicate that.
Yes.
So it's like what stage are you leaving? Maybe you're leaving potty training, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're entering into this other territory. So that's psychological context, I would imagine.
Exactly. Exactly.
I want to read, if you don't mind, I want to read a definition of context that I found online,
Sure.
just a straight definition, and then that might stimulate something else. Context: the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Okay, so that's one definition. The second definition is circumstances, conditions, surroundings, factors, states of affairs. Sorry, these are synonyms.
Yeah.
Situations, environments, milieu, setting, background, um, scene, climate, atmosphere, ambience, mood, and feel.
Mm-hmm.
So, out of that definition, any of those words stand out to you in terms of context as we're exploring this?
I guess the one that stood out the most was circumstances.
Okay. What's standing out to you about circumstances?
Well, what I was talking about before is being real conscious of what are the circumstances I'm in and what's appropriate to say and not say.
Okay. So that's in the present.
Yes, in the present.
Okay.
And then what are the circumstances that caused me to maybe be overreactive in this situation that are coming from past, or the same with other people? What may be the circumstances in their past that are causing them to be overreactive in the
Mm,
present?
yeah. Yeah. And that makes me think of family of origin work,
Mm-hmm.
like Virginia's work with family reconstruction,
Mm-hmm.
where she would create these sculpts where individuals could see their parents meeting as a couple, going through a
Mm-hmm.
courtship period, or them as children being raised by their parents, their grandparents, and seeing
Mm-hmm.
the circumstances by which they were raised? What were
Yes.
the cultural rules, the family rules
Yes.
that set the tone for communication, for connection,
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
love, what was not allowed,
Yes.
and in relationship to what can I feel, what can I say, all of these things that we've touched upon before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, I guess the maybe related to circumstance, one of the words that stood out was um, mood or ambience,
Mm.
uh, which is related to circumstances, but a little less concrete. Like
Yes.
circumstances are
Yes. Uh-huh.
date, date and time,
Yep.
which room were you in, what did people literally say? But
Mm.
when we get into ambience or tone,
Yes.
um, I don't know. It's that definitely is related to context, but it's harder to put your finger on.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you just go into someone's home, you feel something, and you're starting to interact with that environment,
Mm-hmm.
and it's you in relationship, always a relationship between the self and the environment, the context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, what is that? And can you differentiate that between the self distinctively and the other, and where is the overlap? Um, so I guess I'm posing that as a question. How, like, if we think just in a moment, uh, at least on the element of atmosphere and tone, um, yeah, what is distinct in terms of context with that? Like, and maybe you can think of an example where you were in a space where you felt something special, or you felt something maybe disturbing or upsetting just by being there. Um,
Well, just the opposite, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, but I'm going to say it. Several people who have come to our home have said to me, "There's a very nice energy in your home," and I thought, well, that's interesting, you know. And I didn't. How do you define that? I don't know, but
uh,
yeah,
why would you be embarrassed to say
I
that?
don't know. It feels kind of braggy or something, but
Oh, so it sounds like you have a rule about that.
yeah, I guess so.
Um, yeah, well, because we've talked about home as like, a place to return to on the
Mhm.
inside, as like capital S self, like when you return to yourself, maybe that's a home inside. When you
Yes.
think about your physical home, um, I've never been to your house, and with iLearn coming up in October, I'm thinking of maybe inviting myself over.
Oh, I
You
would
know,
love it. I would love it. You know what John Banman said to me one day? Wait, somebody said that in a group or something. Yeah,
yeah.
it's real nice to be at Sharon's home. And John Banman shocked me. He said, yeah. He said, I was at her house and it was real clear. I could go to the refrigerator and get myself something to drink and didn't even have to ask.
Oh,
I'm so
yeah,
surprised.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so.
Um, yeah, I guess it's difficult because I want to ask you, how does it feel to be in your home? But it's kind of like asking someone, you know, how does your voice sound to you?
Yeah,
Or
I
like, how
don't
does
know.
your,
I
it's
don't
like
know. It was complete
you're,
shock to
you're,
me. It felt
yeah, you're in
wonderful,
it.
but I was so surprised, you know.
Mm,
And you know, we love having people here. We love, and maybe that's, you know, the essence of it is just taking joy in people.
mm. Well, one of the ways that we've described congruence. I hesitate to say that we've defined it, but we're talking about it is the flow of energy
Yes,
between people. And I know
yes,
Virginia talked about the flow. Let's say a communication is the flow of information from
mhm,
one person to the other. So
yes,
I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling like I want to connect with you. Would you be open to that? Right?
mhm,
And just
mhm,
like let's just let it out, even though it's vulnerable, even though it's scary. Let's try to break through some of those layers that get in the way. And when I think about the flow of energy as it relates to context, it's um, what you just described, that someone would feel welcome to,
mhm,
get themselves something to eat or to drink if that's what they
mhm,
needed to do to take care of themselves,
mhm.
that's what's going on implicitly, because,
Yes.
I don't know if you had said that,
No,
um,
no, no.
pointed it out,
Uh-uh.
but to feel that in the environment, and to feel that, you know, it's in that sort of continual relationship between yourself, the person that's visiting you, and the environment, um, is quite something. So maybe we can, like, as we, I'm mindful of the time now,
Mm-hmm.
could we think of maybe suggestions for people to consider in terms of how they might play with this idea of context in their lives, um, s- to make it a little bit more concrete,
Mm-hmm.
right? What are some useful ideas or suggestions that you might give to someone so that they start thinking about context? So one thing that I'll start just so you have a time to think
Mm-hmm.
about it. One thing that I think about is just strictly the physical realm of context,
Mm-hmm.
is to think about your, to maybe, and this is something for me to play around with too, is um, how is the physical environment, what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm smelling, the temperature of the room, those physical elements,
Mm-hmm.
how am I using that? Or
Mm-hmm.
how is it not useful to me, what's kind of going on in the physical realm of context?
Mm-hmm.
And to pay attention to that, to be mindful of that. That's a grounding exercise often that people will do, where
Right.
when you've done a lot of work, maybe you've done a visualization or a meditation, to orient yourself back to the room is very important
Mm-hmm.
so you can be present. But I think to try a practice where maybe you go through a whole day and you're paying attention to, what does this physical environment feel like? What is the atmosphere like here?
Mm-hmm.
What is the energy of the room based on its color, its smell, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of culture that we have here, as a different entity to my feeling as an individual, or
Mm-hmm.
you, but to think of context as this third element and to try to grow an awareness of it. So that's
And then
that's
I would add to it the context of a relationship. Where am I at this moment in this relationship? Am I a parent and I need to say something to my partner that is private about how we're dealing with such and such a child? Or am
right.
I a parent getting ready to take 3 children to the grocery store? And how am
Yeah,
I going to deal with that context? Because it's a horrendous one for parents to try to deal with 3 children or whatever at a grocery store, that context. So constantly being aware, what is the context that I'm dealing with here and how can I deal with it?
yeah, yeah. So I guess you're pointing out a more psychological
Mm-hmm.
context, which is what role am I
Yes.
playing? So, for example, let's take a couple that have children and
Mm.
also a business together. They run a business
Okay.
together. So
Okay.
the role is: are we talking as business partners? Which hat am
Yes.
I wearing? Are
Yes.
we talking as a married couple in terms of our
Yes.
romantic life? Are
Yes.
we talking as parents? If one person is talking at the level of business, their business together, and then one parent wants to connect romantically,
Mm-hmm.
they're living in different contexts
Yes.
psychologically, and then
Yes.
there's going to be a huge disconnect there.
Yes.
But to be aware, to be even comment on it, it's like, what hat are you wearing in
Mm-hmm.
relationship to this time, this place that we have together?
Mm-hmm.
Where are you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you could be in the same room but be living in very different contexts.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
an awareness of that, I think, could be very useful.
My
Uh,
sister said that she had pastors who were male, man and woman, who were a couple,
mhm.
and they joked and said they did their business underneath the sheets together. And I thought, yeah, no. If you're still talking about church business and you're in bed together, no,
Yeah, yeah, maybe not the best not
maybe
the
not the
exact
best.
context, yeah, for that. Um, I was thinking about how, within Virginia's mandala, the 8 mandalas, and I had a conversation with Stephen about this in one of the podcast episodes. Those are all different contexts,
Exactly. Yes.
right? Um, in one of those elements is a context, but let's say that I'm feeling physically tired.
Yes.
The context that's calling me is the dream world,
Mm-hmm.
is is my bed, and it's calling me to take care of that element of me.
Mm-hmm.
If there's maybe an existential void, anxiety about the meaning in my life, then that might be a more spiritual context that's calling me. So then I started to think, what is the interaction between feelings and the call upon these different contexts that draw us forth, right?
Hmm.
So a feeling of loneliness might be a feeling that's calling up the need to visit the relational context,
Mm-hmm.
to connect in the arena of meeting and connecting to people I know or new people. So just thinking about context opened up a different way of thinking about feelings. Because
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes we think about feelings as what does the individual need, da, da, da. But to think about that connection between feelings and various contexts,
Yes.
what is the space that I need to visit now, given
Mm-hmm.
what I'm feeling?
That's
Um,
nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
is interesting.
How about just for the audience, if you identify the different choices within the mandala?
Yeah, so the eight
So,
elements of the mandala are um, intellectual, right?
mm-hmm.
So if the context is I'm feeling kind of bored or I'm feeling unstimulated, would it be useful to pick up a book or to ask someone, what are they researching, what's interesting, or listening to a podcast like this that might
Mm-hmm.
explore different ideas and things like that might stimulate the intellectual context. Then there's relational, which I mentioned, so to connect with other people, friends, romantic, family. There's sensual,
Mm-hmm.
so if I'm stuck inside all day, and I'm feeling run down, do I need to visit nature and
Mm-hmm.
be out and get some sunshine, right? So these
Mm-hmm.
contexts might be related to a yearning there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's context, which I think means formally like you know, what's the physical context, am I at work or am I at home?
Yes.
Am I with my family? Am I with friends? Am I at a restaurant? Where am I?
Mm-hmm.
The context. And then what are the other
Nutritional.
nutritional? Yeah, so the context of what's going in and through my body. And one of the things that Stephen Buckby talked to me about is, you can think about nutritional as just a general theme. How am I nurturing myself?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think in the realm of context, it's you know different cravings or different appetites um, that are connected to different feelings might point us in different directions, right? So if I'm sick, what I want to be nurtured by is maybe a cup of warm soup. If I'm feeling like yesterday, I was sitting on my front porch with my son, who's 2.5, and we were staring at the ice cream truck that was like blasting its tune for
Yes.
like 10 minutes, and we were just looking, and he just kept saying ice cream truck, ice cream truck, ice cream truck. And then in one moment he says, I want an ice cream. And he said it
Oh.
so clearly. And I said, okay. So then I ran inside, got some money, came out, got an ice cream, and then he was not into it. So
Oh.
yeah, he changed his mind. He was like, nope, I don't, like whether it was cold or if it was just something
Ah,
new, he,
interesting.
he
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to try it. Um, but that's a context of exploration and of
Yep.
fun and um, you know, gaining weight and being joyful, hopefully about that. And there's a spiritual.
Oh, yes.
Uh, that
Forgot.
and which again we talked about. It's like there's what is my connection to life? What is my
Yes.
connection to meaning? What is if you believe in God, what's my connection to
Mm-hmm.
God? um and context, interactional, spiritual, sensual, emotional, intellectual, physical. Yeah, I think we got them all. um but then there's more.
Mm-hmm.
What's your financial situation, right? That's a
Yeah.
context,
Oh, geez.
right?
Yes.
And so
Mm.
there's other kind of ways which could probably be integrated to one of the dimensions, but
Yeah.
it's and then career, right? That's another context
Yes.
that could be parceled out. So
Yeah.
um,
As you said, it's an ocean. There's so many ways you can
there's so many ways to talk
think
about it,
about
you know,
context. Yeah.
and I think one way of thinking about it is when we're talking about context, we're talking about the what's happening in the spaces, what's happening in the space between you and I,
Mm-hmm.
what's the temperature of a space,
Mm-hmm.
um, and in a therapeutic context, what what is that room and what is that therapist doing in order to hold the space,
Hmm.
the sacredness of working with someone through
Yes.
a healing and growth process,
Yes.
what what is happening in that space for that person so that they can take a risk, be vulnerable,
Exactly.
do their work. So context is everything, and
Yes.
we could
Yes.
talk more and more about this.
Yes.
So why don't we? Does that seem like an okay place to at least stop
Absolutely.
for today?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we stop there and